Hey, well, I'm super excited for this one. I first came across Dr. Terrell Morton 2 years ago. I came across a video on YouTube called Diversity in STEM, and I was like so amped up afterwards. And what I heard was just absolutely amazing. I contacted our project manager who's here, Silvana Carrion Palomares, and I was like, we need to figure a way to get this man onto our NSF grant as a facilitator to lead one of our workshops, and he's come and facilitated a number of workshops for us, and they've been just really mind-opening and incredible. And Dr. Terrell Morton is an assistant professor of identity and justice in STEM education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is an alumnus of North Carolina A&T State University. His Bachelor of Science is in chemistry, and University of Miami, where he got an MS in neuroscience, and UNC Chapel Hill, where he did his PhD education in learning sciences and psychological studies. Dr. Morton identifies as a scholar activist. His work strives to transform the positioning and understanding of Blackness in mainstream education, specifically STEM, seeking justice and joy for Black women, Black students, and other minoritized individuals, given the social, cultural, political, and historical positioning of their identities. He is an accomplished emerging scholar, having published in an array of academic and lay spaces, given over 50 global and national talks and presentations, and obtained over $13 million in external grants. Through every endeavor, he strives to walk it like he talks it. So please welcome Dr. Morton.
Thank you so much, Kiran, Silvana, other organizers of this space, for the invitation to be able to share with you virtually thoughts around such a very necessary and important topic. I'm super excited to continue to be in community with you all, as you all have been thinking intentionally about not just defining equity, but truly engaging equity-focused behaviors, actions, and outcomes specific to serving Black and Brown students in STEM within the community college space. And so I'm excited to be here, though I wish I could be in sunny California, because I'm certain that the weather that you all are having is just a little bit more amazing than the weather that I'm having currently. But that is okay. I'm not going to let that damper my joy. And we're going to keep charting the course ahead as I share with you all some thoughts today around this concept of equity, hoping then that in providing this information and insight, that you all can build from these ideas and others as you continue to think intentionally about engaging equity-focused practices and looking to champion those practices as you strive to empower Black and Brown learners in STEM. And so from that perspective, the title of my presentation is Interrogating and in parentheses, Conceptualizing Equity, Movements Towards Black Liberation in STEM. As a qualitative research scholar and as somebody within the educational sciences, I believe that it is always important for me to start off with positionality. Positionality reflects how a person perceives, understands, and engages the world. It accounts for their particular perspectives of knowledge, truth, reality, morality, and how those different ideas then inform the ways that they interact with themselves as how they interact with others. And so I start this conversation around positionality, but more specifically, my positionality, so that as we enter into conversations around equity and this idea of interrogating and reconceptualizing it, you all can begin to understand how I'm entering into this particular conversation, what it is that I believe to be true about knowledge, truth, reality, morality, and how that then shows up within the different walks of life that I maintain. And so I can talk to you about who I am. As you heard earlier, you heard about my educational pedigree, receiving a Bachelor's of Sciences in Chemistry from the illustrious North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, receiving a master's degree in neuroscience with an emphasis in neurobiology from the University of Miami down in Miami, Florida, and then receiving my PhD in education with a concentration in learning sciences and psychological studies from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Outside of my educational pedigree, however, I think about the other meaningful characteristics, identities, and moments that comprise who I am and how it is that I choose to show up in this world. And so I think about my experiences as a scientist and what that afforded me in terms of presenting and engaging in the knowledge construction and dissemination space. I think about the very strong historical roots and legacies that I come from, recognizing that my maternal grandparents were educators and civil rights activists, and that my paternal grandparents were also educators and civil rights activists in North Carolina, and how those lessons then passed on to my parents, who then passed those lessons on to me, and what activism means in terms of how I engage the work that I do, and what that then means when it comes to not just researching and studying these ideas, but being very intentional to generate change in my community and for communities that reflect the different identities for me or of me. And so my positionality thus represents more than just my identity, but it also affords me to think about the privileges that I've been afforded as a result of my identity. And I've had somebody actually ask me the question, how is it that I list my educational pedigree as a privilege when in fact I did actually work hard for those particular degrees, recognizing that when we name privilege, we specifically talk about unearned opportunities and capital. Well, I have the privilege of saying that I am a fourth generation college graduate, and I am a third generation PhD holder. And I recognize that that institutional knowledge about how to go to college, how to be successful in college, and then how to go and be successful beyond a bachelor's degree is a form of knowledge that I did not earn, but was knowledge that was given to me as a result of the trials, the tribulations, and the struggles of my grandparents, great-grandparents who were navigating these spaces before me. And so, yes, privilege is this unearned capital, this unearned resources and opportunities. That knowledge of knowing how to traverse educational spaces isn't something that I earned, but is in fact a privilege that I've been able to inherit and then leverage. And so as a result of my privileges, I've been exposed to many things. And those awarenesses that I've been able to gain from the exposures has then led to the commitments that I make, the choices that I make in terms of how I want to communicate who I am, what I do, and how I do it. But then even more importantly, going beyond this space of thinking about commitments to then thinking about actions, the actual steps, behaviors that I produce that allow others outside of me to see who I am, what I value, and what I believe. My positionality is primarily informed by these two theoretical frameworks: phenomenological variant ecological systems theory and critical race theory. Phenomenological variant ecological systems theory, or PVEST for short, is a framework that stems out of child development being developed by Margaret Spencer from the University of Chicago that looks at the relationship between the external ecosystem, building from Brothenbrenner's bioecosystem model of a micro, meso, exo, macro, and an individual's perceptions, understandings, engagements, and responses to stress. This theory allows us to ask questions about the relationship between external influences and internal decision-making when it comes to identity development, coping mechanisms, and even life stage outcomes. Critical race theory, which I will talk a little bit more about, gives us the opportunity to interrogate questions around power, oppression that is systematic and structural, as it is connected to a structural form of racism or gendered racism, and how that then manifests through all of our social institutions, organizations, norms, values, and beliefs, particularly here within the US. I use critical race theory and PVES to ask very intentional questions about external influences, internal influences, decision-making, and outcome, as it is nested within the structural racist or gendered racist system that we are all navigating, given the founding of the United States and the basis of this institution, this social institution of the US, stemming from the attempted extermination of indigenous peoples, the forced enslavement of African people brought to these lands, and then the continued subjugation of people based off of presumed, quote unquote, biological basis of race. Critical race theory counters these perspectives when it comes to thinking about race essentialism, when it comes to thinking about individual acts of hate as racism, to helping us think intentionally about that system and that structure. And in recognizing that there's a lot of mainstream conversation and discourse right now around critical race theory, I am always intentional to provide a little bit more additional context on that particular framework, as I hope then that those who engage with the ideas that I put forward are able to understand critical race theory a little bit better and can be able to point towards primary source information when it comes to naming and engaging it as a framework. And the metaphor that I use to explain critical race theory goes like this. If you're walking along a lake and you happen to see one fish belly side up, this one fish is not performing in the same kind of way that other fish are performing in this body of water. Most people tend to ask the question, what's wrong with the fish? We can individually localize that this particular fish is not behaving in a manner that is similar to others. And so something must have happened to that fish. However, if we're walking along a lake and we see hundreds of thousands of fish who are now belly side up, who are now performing this particular abnormal-like behavior, rather than asking individual questions about the fish, we tend to then ask questions about the lake. What is wrong with this system that has now allowed all of these fish to demonstrate this particular type of behavior or outcome? Critical race theory as an academic framework gives us that opportunity to say the exact same thing about racism. And rather than looking at individual acts of hate being done by people who have intentional desires to cast hateful messages and outcomes, we can think about the system. We can think about the cultural norms. We can think about the policies. We can think about the presumed practices that are associated with a presumed normality that has facilitated the space in which we continue to see subjugation and minoritization on the basis of race or on the basis of gendered race identities. So critical race theory helps shift our understandings from being very individual-centric to being very systematic and structural when we're naming racism, thereby giving us the opportunity to be very systematic and structural when we're thinking about dismantling racism within our various social institutions. And because critical race theory is intentional in pushing conversations from individuals to systems and structures, not only does critical race theory give us the power to critique the presence of racism more broadly speaking, but it allows us to do the same thing when we raise specific questions about representation, when we raise specific questions about diversity, access, accessibility, inclusion, equity, justice. It allows us to say, what is wrong with the systems? What is wrong with the structures? What is wrong with the norms, policies, beliefs, and practices that are organizing these social institutions that is now constraining engagement in these particular spaces that lead to the underrepresentation of people, as opposed to taking very individualistic, pathological assumptions of people that say what's wrong with this particular group of people and why are they not capable of being represented in this space. And so I use critical race theory and phenomenological variant ecological systems theory as frameworks to engage the research that I conduct when I specifically look at Black STEM student experiences in post-secondary spaces. And these frameworks, again, being very intentional to raise questions around structural racism and gendered racism, external influences, internal influences, and decision-making prompted me to be very intentional and critical about how we're considering the state of Black experiences in STEM, but more specifically, the state of Blackness in STEM post this 2020 epidemic and pandemics that have been transpiring. And so what was sort of that 2020 jarring to our collective consciousness around Blackness, you might ask? Well, it first started off with coronavirus and what coronavirus or COVID-19 meant for the changing of our institutions, for the changing of our interactions, for the changing of the ways in which people gathered, navigated, and engaged in spaces. How that then forced the United States, as well as the world more broadly, to contend with the continued perpetuation of anti-Black racism against Black bodies, as we were made to bear witness to the murders of George Floyd, Rekia Boyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, that prompted what a lot of people called a quote-unquote racial awakening. And so in response to these mechanisms and in response to these atrocities that were transpiring, we started to see a lot of broad-scale public display of dedicated commitments to Blackness. So we had the painting of Black Lives Matter. We had the renaming of streets and spaces and places. Many of our institutions or professional organizations or departments started putting out statements towards our commitments to Black lives and our commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, access, and justice. And that then was met by an insurrection in 2021, where there was an attempted coup to take over the nation's capital as a means to quote unquote bring back a supposed greatness to the nation because of a particular group's perspectives on what should have transpired as a result of the presidential election. And we witnessed then during this insurrection a rise in very attempted hateful outcomes, where here in Los Angeles at that particular time, there was almost a public lynching of a Black woman that took place in the middle of the streets. And had there not been someone to actually physically wrap themselves around her and physically remove her from that space, that hateful mob would have continued to assault her physically and potentially lynch her in that space. This was then met by broader socio-political conversations around what types of knowledge we would protect and what types of knowledge we would advance and what types of knowledge we would respect here within the United States. As these conversations around banning ideas, anti-woke legislation taking place in attempts to then determine not just what's being taught in K-12 schools, but what also would be taught in higher education, recognizing these direct attacks against Black history, as well as direct attacks against engaging critical perspectives of how and why systemic racism or anything pertaining to social justice would be needed to be in conversation in these educational spaces. We saw that then manifest more recently in attempts to remove politicians who were being intentional to advocate for things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that then began to transpire intersectionally when we thought not just about race, but also sexuality and gender and the rights of people to proclaim, make decisions over their own bodies, leading up to even more recently, our Supreme Court decision against affirmative action in college admissions. And what all of this meant in terms of this broader collective consciousness around how we within the United States particularly perceived and engaged Blackness as a concept and as a reality, but then also Black people, Black experiences, Black histories, Black legacies, and Black possibilities. So thinking right about this socio-political cultural context in which we are presently operating, drawing from both that critical race theory and that PVEST frame to think about what this external meant for internal decisions and outcomes, I started to raise critical questions around this concept of equity. What does equity actually even mean in our current lives and in our present realities? And even more specifically, how are we as a society starting to operationalize this concept of equity, particularly within the domains of STEM, recognizing the expertise and the contextual influences and interests that I maintain? And so I launched a research study where the guiding research question for this study was, how do early career scholars trained in and focused on STEM education conceptualize equity within their research and praxis? Thinking about that next generation of scholars, graduate students, early career faculty, research scientists who are engaging in this research and praxis-based space, how are they defining equity? And what does that definition then look like when it came to the research and the practice that they were engaging? And so this was a very exploratory case study design. It was localized to a particular professional development experience that intentionally targeted early career scholars who had an interest in STEM education, research, and practice. And so these were doctoral students, candidates, postdoctoral scholars, and people who were no more than 3 years post their PhD that comprised the sample. And the data that I drawed from were open-ended survey responses, artifacts such as written application materials for access to this space, prompts and written responses to those prompts, as well as observations as they were engaging in critical conversations around STEM education, research, and praxis, using then a very open coding schema that was informed by conceptions of equity to help me then analyze this perspective. And so this open coping schema led me to then these two particular studies to think intentionally around how we might be able to define or pursue definitions of equity. One paper being written by Terrence Burgess and Alexis Patterson, both STEM or science education scholars, talked about equity across domains or across ecosystems, where a macro perspective of equity focused on systemic change. A meso perspective of equity was really thinking about culture and norms and disrupting that white supremacist culture that would sort of be situated among communities and groups. Where a macro level perspective of equity would be really focusing on individual interactions and engagements, that lived experience that people would have. I also then doing reading around conceptions of equity to think about what kind of framework could help me operationalize this study was drawn to Bonilla Silver's work, who talks a lot about this concept of colorblind racism. And one of the ideas that Bonilla Silver put forward was this abstract liberalism, this idea of using political and economic ideas and concepts to frame matters of race and racism, where political in this abstract liberalistic space really focused on equal opportunity, and then economic in this abstract liberalistic space really focused on choice and individualism, thereby giving me the opportunity to think about things like what could be considered reasonable in this concept of equity, or what could be considered moral in this concept of equity, and how is it in conversation with these systems. So bridging these frameworks together devised this quadrant where we can look sort of top to bottom or horizontally, thinking about the layers of the system. What is that macro level structure in terms of systemic change? What is this meso level community-based space in terms of disrupting norms? Or what is this micro level individual noticing based space as we're thinking about equity? And then, vertically, not horizontal, thinking vertically, macro to micro, and then thinking horizontally, this perspective of abstract liberalism to what presumably would take place on the other end of the continuum, a really strong transformative critical approach. And so in dividing this quadrant up, we would then read it to say, perspectives of equity that would be in this top left-hand corner being closest to abstract liberalism, but also being closest to macro level perspectives, would mean that somebody would define equity in conversation with systems. So they might name it as being connected to systems, but when they operationalized equity, it would often bypass those systems. So the operationalization of equity wouldn't be intentional in disrupting it, right? Because that abstract space is very much connected to political and economic forces. Whereas in the bottom left quadrant, we would see this same concept of abstract liberalism, but being very localized to an individual's day-to-day interactions and noticing, where equity would then be equated to individuality, and equity would then be applied in a very universal way. Top right, getting closer to the transformative critical and also the systemic, which means equity will be conceived as a critical systemic change-focused endeavor, where bottom right would be equity would be situated in a critical perspective, but will be very localized to individual change, as opposed to localized at a broader systemic change. So taking this theoretical framework or conceptual framework that I developed, I applied it to that data and began to analyze with this framework how people were defining and operationalizing equity, early career scholars, by the way. And what I found was that there was a lot of methodological, individualistic definitions of equity that were leading how these supposed early career scholars were engaging with this space. And so equity was very much constantly in conversation with intentional individual actions. But this concept of trying to get to systemic change would have to occur through individual change first. And it was always sort of privileging this action theoretic line of thinking. So individual action leading then to a collective action. So saying the collective then reflected the sum of sort of individual parts. And this is some data, if you want to read it, that sort of led to me thinking about this equity as a methodologically individualistic endeavor, something that is intentional, but individualistic, and attempting to be additive as it works towards this broader systemic change. And then there was another sort of branch of how people were defining equity, which was very intentional to implicate white supremacist ideologies and power systems as both the impetus for oppression and the focal point of where change needed to occur. So instead of entering into equity in some of this abstract individual change, and as multiple individuals come together, the collective change, this group of scholars was like, no, we are going to name it as this systemic space. And we are going to couch it within this particular theoretical framework. And by doing so, it gives us the opportunity to target intentionally policies, practices, and procedures that need to be transformed, building from perspectives of humanity, building from perspectives of anti-racism, building from perspectives of dismantling root causes to drive change. I want you all to hold that for just a minute, because in engaging this work again, another study, similar perspective, was now saying, well, how do STEM faculty, administrators, and program staff involved in STEM broadening participation to some kind of endeavor also define and operationalize equity within their programs? So thinking about faculty, thinking about people who run research labs, thinking about people who mentor STEM students through some of our pathway programs that are taking place, how are they actually defining and thinking about equity as they are trying to engage this endeavor of broadening participation and access and engagement? So very similar case study, 13 individuals who are affiliated with broadening participation programs. 4 were faculty, 4 were administrators, 3 identified as program staff, and 1 person identified as like a social sciences researcher. The data was short answer responses from open-ended surveys, observations, and then artifacts that were collected, where in a very similar manner, I used sort of this open thematic coding perspective, no real framework to begin with, but just open to see what was shared. And we found, right, that there were very different distinctions in how these groups were defining equity with relationship to student access and participation. So we saw that there were idealized versions of equity. This is what we hope to aspire to obtain by having this equity-focused perspective. There was equity being very much in conversation with demographic representation, and that equating to equity in terms of how we engage these spaces. There were conversations of equity being very resource contingent, so equating equity only to the tools and resources that are being provided or offered to particular groups. And then there was equity that was defined with a very particular perspective on barriers. How do we actually remove and dismantle barriers that assist or prevent access and engagement in these spaces? Where 1 out of the 13 individuals gave a very specific theoretical framework for their definition of equity. And so as I look across both of these studies, and I think intentionally about this concept of equity, one of the things, I'm sorry, I forgot that they operationalized equity. These professionals operationalized equity in terms of activities like inclusive teaching, inclusive advising, providing scholarships, and they operationalized equity in terms of outcomes, really wanting to see the trajectory of these activities and how that they would make a particular impact on the target populations that they were hoping to engage within these broadening participation endeavors, such as enrollment, remediation, or retention, those outcome-focused spaces, as how they operationalized equity. And so now, right, thinking across these two studies, asking very critical questions about if we take on equity and equating it solely to numerical representation, if we're situating our perspectives to demographics, then are we truly ensuring that the students that we are engaging are actually having relevant and meaningful experiences? Or are we only focused on providing access and not in thinking intentionally about the systems and the structures that are happening within our classroom spaces, within our learning spaces, within our research spaces, and the extent to which the experiences are truly equitable for our participants? If we don't have a critical approach to equity that intentionally accounts for student perspectives, because note, in any of the definitions, nothing talks specifically about building from the lived experiences and perspectives of the people that we strive to serve, then again, how are we ensuring that the activities and the goals that we are doing are actually bringing about transformative change, as opposed to these activities being socializers into pre-existing models and schemas about what life should be and how it could look? And then, right, from this professional space, how can there be more intentional efforts around the framings of our programming design, implementation, and assessment from this critical strengths-based approach, so that as we're engaging equity, we're not engaging it from a perspective that could reify deficit-oriented pathological assumptions about people and their ability to navigate, access, and engage spaces. From this other perspective, right, if we have a very methodological, individualistic conception of equity, where we have to then take this stepwise mechanism of build out a collective, and then the collective moves towards this change and action, then how are we moving in a way that's really going to transform if we have to constantly be thinking about changes in individual mindsets? What does incremental change actually offer us in terms of creating truly transformative spaces? But then also, what does incremental change do to limit or hinder us from being able to truly transform spaces and places? And again, if we have these critically situated perspectives around equity in our community-based perspectives and not our individual-based perspectives, and in our systemic structural-based perspectives, how are we then capable of driving systemic and cultural change without having to do an incremental approach? What is that radical reimagining of culture, of norms, of values, of beliefs and practices that can transpire without having to take the each one, reach one method to changing mindsets and getting people to believe in these particular endeavors and spaces, recognizing, again, considering this post-2020 backdrop, that there is this urgency of now to really try to mitigate and even repair from a reparative state the traumas that are being continuously enacted on Black individuals or Black and Brown individuals as we move forward as a nation. And so putting these musings out there, a next sort of deeper level question could be, why is it that we have this very individualistic approach to equity? Why is it that we believe that this incrementalist ideal is the strategy towards equity? Why is it that we are so focused on individualism, so focused on providing access, providing resources, and providing barriers, as opposed to something a little bit more radical, critical, transformative, and even imaginative in our particular perspectives of equity? And that prompted me to then go into some of our legal scholarship and theorizing around these conceptions of justice and how social justice, or even justice period as a phenomena, is defined within our legal, political, and cultural doctrines within the United States. And how we think about justice has been primarily discussed from this particular legal philosopher, Jonathan Rawls, that talks about justice as being fairness, seeing in this image, right, equity accounting for barriers and providing resources, but justice then being the removal of barriers so that there is this fair opportunity in which people are able to engage, participate, and navigate different spaces. And this theory of justice, where justice as fairness, raises questions around equal access in veins that are similar to others. It presumes fair treatment in manners that are reasonably expected. And it is because it is rooted in a very liberalistic ideology of assuming that every individual moving towards or living in this society as a collective shares very similar belief patterns around what is considered to be rational behavior. And so because every individual in this collective is operating from a rational mindset, the collective must de facto be rational in terms of how it is operating. And because we can presume, right, that the collective is rational, because this represents the sum of rational individuals, if we were to ever get to a space in which there was an irrational act taking place, then it must be because of one irrational person who is operating from a mindset that doesn't reflect collective values, beliefs, and perspectives. And so that one irrational person, therefore, can be dealt with and removed from the collective so that the collective can continue to operate in a way that is rational and good. That is sort of the philosophical grounds to this justice as fairness, this very much incremental, individualistic approach to collective organizing and perspectives that assumes that the collective is rational because it is the sum of individual rational people. But as critical scholars, critical legal scholars, who then led the way for critical race scholars, started asking questions about this theory of justice, they raised questions around who comprises this collective, who actually has the rights and the liberties to decide what constitutes a collective. And as a collective, who then gets to decide what is justice, what is injustice, and in the face of injustices, who then makes the determination of what kind of actions must happen in order for justice to be served? So going one layer deeper to this assumed collective rational to ask questions as to who counts as part of this collective, and how do their particular beliefs drive what represents the collective? And so examining affirmative action legislation that took place in the 60s and 70s, you had Alan Freeman and Charles Lawrence looking at Supreme Court decisions to say that in cases of racial discrimination, the Supreme Court would often favor the perpetrator of these incidences as opposed to the victim, because the Supreme Court would rule that in order for racial discrimination to be proven, it did not matter what the impact was or how the victim experienced racial discrimination. What mattered was being able to determine the intent of the perpetrator, and if the perpetrator actually intended to enact racial discrimination and oppression. Because again, if a perpetrator intended to enact intentional harm, then they individually would be an irrational person, and they would not represent that rational collective. And so making rulings from this mindset that constantly favored the perpetrator over the victim facilitated a space in which systemic racism, structural gendered racism could continue to persist, even if individual actors could not be named or implicated as the cause for how and why these perspectives were taking place. This justice as fairness, rooted in this individual liberalistic ideology, thus becomes the underlying philosophical beliefs that drive how we operationalize and define diversity, equity, inclusion, or even anti-racism, as we're starting to name it as a particular construct, depending on whose particular scholarship you are reading, and whether you are reading scholarship that is akin to racial justice, as opposed to reading scholarship particular to quote unquote anti-racism that is a little bit more contemporary. And we see this philosophy of justice underlying these diversity, equity, inclusion, or anti-racist endeavors, because again, conceptions around rational behavior, collective action, and individual actions. But what that critical purview then says when we ask questions about the collective is that this practice of justice is now rooted in a culture of whiteness, a culture that perpetuates a continued perspective, a continued assumption, a continued sense of normality that others who don't necessarily ascribe to or are represented by this archetype are made or subjugated to respond to because they aren't represented in this concept of a collective. And so when I think about culture, I'm intentionally drawing from anthropology, sociology, and psychology. I'm thinking about what the science of ideas represents when we say culture, and how that then shows up in things that we consider to be normal, and espouse values and belief systems that are presumed to be inherent, that are not always externally communicated, but are made for people to respond to in a consistent space. And I say that this perspective is rooted in this culture of whiteness, because if we look historically, again, at the founding of these lands, whose lived experiences, whose perspectives of reality, whose perspectives of normality and truth serve as those quote unquote foundational principles that we all adhere to, it came out of this physical and cultural imperialistic perspective that changed the broader landscape of knowledge, truth, and reality, where indigenous, Afrocentric, or even feminist ways of knowing, doing, and being were rejected. were deemed to be unscientific and irrational, and then were socialized out of people based off of industries such as the education system that was meant to train particular mindsets and to adopt particular beliefs, values, and systems for these diverse groups of people. And we see that particularly within science, where ideologically, science, this Western Eurocentric concept, was used as a means to justify racial subjugation, where there was quote unquote research done to prove a connection between skull sizes and the potential intellect of an individual, where leading thinkers in our Constitution and space believed that there was an innate inferiority of Black individuals, which would prompt then the allowability of their subjugation to their slave masters. And how social Darwinism was very much connected to then scientific racism, as research was continuing to prove genetic superiority of races and spaces, that then translated to the actual methods and tools that we engage in science, where practices in both science and even health sciences stem back to very racist practices that began during the moment of enslavement, where things such as genetic code and understanding how genetics then formulates particular outcomes can be connected very much to the eugenics movement, or how we even have practices around public health that are connected to intentional experimentations that were inhumane and unjustly conducted on people. That then presents itself as these objective, individualistic, sort of competitive-based spaces or assumed spaces that constitutes our culture of STEM. And so thinking about this then for the particular implications for Black students, we see it showing up in our DEI spaces, where again, individualism continues to reign supreme, and how we're operationalizing and engaging what we want to see as perspectives of equity, access, and inclusion, whose voices get to determine acts of injustice as well as acts of justice. That looks like in STEM opportunities to fix quote unquote students as we strive to assimilate and accommodate their identities and lived experiences into STEM spaces, as opposed to trying to transform these systems and structures that are continuing to operate on individuals within these spaces. That presents then itself as very anti-Black sentiments, where there's intentional erasure and rejection of Black life, Black liberty, Black possibilities, where there's an intentional erasure of Black history and how we're thinking about what those cultural representations meant for people's access, engagement, and participation. Where instead of engaging in these objective-based practices, we instead engage in this meritocratic-based practices that then tokenize Blackness and Black life, or essentialize Black student experiences, that then stigmatize them, where we are now pathologically equating Black to less than, where we're now equating Black pathologically to at risk or being incapable, that have these very deficit-oriented, derogatory-based assumptions about Black possibilities and spaces. Where anti-Blackness is, again, this disdain for the Black body, because Black people were presumed to be less than human, given enslavement and what it meant legally, politically, socially, culturally, that then prompts Blackness to always be in conversation with social structure and interpersonal death and suffering. So you might be asking, right? We're thinking about equity. We saw how scholars and practitioners we're defining it in these very individualistic, sort of abstract, liberalistic perspectives. We've now connected it to philosophically how theories of justice that are guiding our social, political, historical, and cultural norms, values, beliefs, and practices here are prompting this perspective of equity for these individuals, but also others. And then that next step deeper in terms of how our theories of justice are rooted in these very white supremacist ideologies that present as very anti-Black sentiments when it comes to thinking about Black students' engagement, access, and participation in STEM. What are you supposed to do with all of that information? How are you supposed to take it and process it and implement it in this space as you're looking to move forward, particularly within the 2-year learning space, in supporting and empowering and engaging Black and Brown learners in STEM? Well, the first question that I say in terms of what are you supposed to do with this knowledge is, who do you want to be in this fight? And do you see yourselves operating as a perpetrator where you are intentionally leveraging your privilege and power to explicitly contribute to oppression? Or do you find yourself somewhere in the gray space of leveraging privilege and power? Or are you at the other end of the spectrum where you are either a conspirator against the fight, where you're intentionally leveraging your privilege and power to explicitly combat oppression, or a co-conspirator where you are leveraging your privilege and power to explicitly combat the oppression of groups that are not like you? And in this space, right, of thinking of championing and empowering, I went to the dictionary, Merriam-Webster's dictionary, to kind of think about what those terms meant, where championing as like this action means to defend, to support, to defy, and to defeat, where empowering means to give authority, to enable, and to promote. And so seeing this organizing space as opportunities to help facilitate the championing of people in this fight through empowerment, we're having a good me-to-me conversation to say that we are hoping, and I'm speaking broadly as a we, though I recognize that others may say something else, that means that as a collective, we are bringing about actions to dismantle, break through, and overcome opposition that strives to reinforce these hegemonic perspectives in this fight for equity, in this fight for intentional systemic structural change as the guiding concepts of equity. This space serves as an opportunity to say, let us defend, let us dismantle, let us break through and overcome that opposition that attempts to stand against us in this fight. And then as you're engaging in your sessions and your conversations, developing those very specific strategies, accessing those very specific resources and tools to then critically reimagine and operationalize a new world, not just equity, but a new world and a perspective that is really rooted in justice and that is oppression-free. And so I'm reminded of what Audre Lorde says in this space as we talk about championing and empowering, as we think about defending and overcoming opposition to structural transformation, and as we think about providing tools and resources to actually do that work. Let us be mindful that how we go about this work also has to be transformative. We can't take very additive measures and approaches to thinking about dismantling and transforming barriers. Otherwise, we will constantly be operating within that same paradigm in which this house that we are attempting to dismantle will be the very same house that's giving us the resources to dismantle it. And no institution that's looking to be dismantled is going to give you resources. I mean, no institution that's looking to withstand is going to give you resources to dismantle. And so the tools that I engage and would encourage you all to engage is to be very intentional around advancing concepts that focus on liberation. I focus on Black liberation, but we can think about Black and Brown liberation, or we can think about an intersectional gendered race liberation, or an intersectional gendered race class ability status liberation, where we start with the brilliance of people as opposed to starting with what people lack. Where we reinsert those historical narratives that have been left out, where we attempt and intentionally disrupt those anti-Black biases, where we value their voice and contributions. We embrace their engagement. We center joy in this space as opposed to centering trauma and oppression. And we're intentional to not repathologize people by recognizing within group diversity. So telling stories then from strengths-based approaches as opposed to deficit-based approaches. Positioning our students, Black students, as theorizers as opposed to being commodities and consumers of knowledge, but seeing them as actual theorizers, creators, and innovators of knowledge. Reimagining then those theories and those tools and those methods that we use to collect data, to interpret data, and to analyze data, so that we're also continuously engaging in this critical strengths-based approach. So that then we can strive for and push these reimagined cultures, thinking intentionally about norms and reimagining those from a critical perspective, thinking intentionally about values, beliefs, and practices, and reimagining those from a critical perspective. Here are some of the research projects where I am continuing to do this work in terms of how I look to nuance Black epistemologies and stories, doing so in collective with this phenomenal group of scholars. Here is how I work to sort of reimagine courses and content and knowledge at the undergraduate level, where we really start to ask critical questions about what science content should we be teaching? Why should we be teaching that content? And how does that content reflect the lived identities, experiences, histories, legacies, and multiple ways of knowing, doing, and being of people, as opposed to being a socializing canon into one particular domain of knowledge and understanding. And then again, trying to be intentional to build from an unspeakable joy, recognizing that even in moments of trauma, people still have joy. People engage joy and operate through joy. How can we allow that to serve as our new centerpieces as we're thinking about reimagining, re-engaging, operationalizing a critical strengths-based approach to equity as champions in this space? Because ultimately, as we're thinking about liberation, I think J. Cole said it best when he said, all we want to do is be free. Free from these structures and oppressions that continue to regulate us, control us, constrain us, and prevent us from being able to just be who we are, as opposed to having to be resistant, resilient, and constantly in these stress-based coping mechanism responding situations in our lived experiences and in our STEM education spaces. And that is all that I have. I might have gone over a few minutes. I know that there is a Q&A that follows afterwards, so I presume that there won't be any questions at this particular moment.
Thank you so much. As always, we are so grateful for you and the knowledge that you share with us, and just opening up the community. There will be a Q&A that happens after. It'll start at 2 to give everybody a break, especially you. And I'm so grateful for everybody for joining and that you get to hear Dr. Morton's philosophies and applications here that are so essential to STEM education and especially equity. Thank you again.
See you all shortly.